Welcome to another exciting episode of Humanity 8.0, a podcast where we talk about our post-truth present and our transhuman future, with the aim of sketching out the outlines of what awaits us in the years and the decades ahead of us. This podcast is brought to you by Rokos. Companies with limited IT budgets and personnel can now get the same cybersecurity protection as big enterprises. Rokos' Secure Access Service Edge, SASE solution, with zero trust, provides enterprise-grade comprehensive cybersecurity so that you can focus on your business. For more, please visit www.rokos.com. That's ROQOS.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo.
Professor David Gunkel, welcome to Humanity 8.0.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, you bet. Thank you so much. As I was telling you, you are a busy man from your Twitter feed. I think you're publishing at least 2 articles a day, and you have a whole bunch of books that you have written, are writing, and are thinking of writing. It just feels like you are really into it, which is wonderful, right? I think we are, like you and I, people are really interested in technology, especially in AI. I think we feel lucky to be witnessing all this.
Yeah, it's a good and interesting time to be alive because a lot is happening in a very short period of time. So
Yeah,
I tell my students all the time that, what they see around them as challenges and crises are actually good signs because it means things are changing and they're going to be part of that future. So yeah, it's an interesting time to actually confront these things.
yeah. I think what's interesting is that this whole AI thing is bringing to life I don't know, philosophical debates that have been going on for a long time, and they have been confined into a collection of philosophers and maybe people who are interested in philosophy. But now the layperson is asking these questions, right? What does it mean to to be sentient? What does it mean to be to understand? Questions that people didn't worry about because it was what it was, right? So I find that also really interesting. It just surfaces these basic important so let's call them evergreen questions.
Technology always functions as a kind of mirror in which we see ourselves. And so with these developments in AI and with computers and digital technology, etc., we have a way of reflecting back to ourselves some basic questions, as you were saying, about our own position in the universe and how we think about who we are and what we are and why we are. And so I think you're exactly right. A lot of the questions that are being asked in the face of AI and in the face of robots are actually very old questions that can go all the way back to Plato. But it's really interesting to see how they've been refreshed in this mirror that we have before us now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that what's also interesting is the following, and maybe I'm going to cite something anecdotal, and I need to do my research, and I share this with you, is that several of the folks out there who are, in fact, in academia, and in fact, who are philosophers, I think all 3 of my data points are philosophers, are talking about AI and ChatGPT. And I know for a fact, because they told me so, that they have not even tried, for example, ChatGPT, right? And so they're coming from a, and not only they didn't try, but they're very proud, it seems, to not have been, I don't know, contaminated by it or taken in as a sucker, as far as they're concerned, right? So they're coming in from, and they are not mincing words in their criticism, right? They come in and they say, for example, they say, these AIs are not able to create anything new, right? Because they are basing them, because their input is always something from the past, okay? So therefore, boom. And for me, it's like when somebody says like something like that, I say, well, tell me, what do you know? Is it scientifically proven what creating something new means so that you can make such a statement, right? Number one. Number two, aren't we, if I'm going to take the other extreme position, which I don't, aren't we also basically creatures of our past and our current input, right? That's all it is, right? You have your past, you have stimuli, and you have a brain, right? If I want to simplify it like that, I don't want to simplify it, but just for the sake of countering back. And even that simplistic counter back just puts them in a corner, right? And I give them a couple of examples, say, okay, here's, for example, a utility that I use it all the time. And by the way, I personally use it all the time. And it's not because I am into this world of, because I make my living in AI, but even my friends who are not in that world, they use it all the time. People who are not, who are not interested in criticizing the tool. They just want to use it wherever way they want to use it, right? So I give them the example of, okay, I have a 2,000 word essay. I hate creating abstracts because it's hard. I ask it to create an abstract from that 2,000 word essay. It gives me something not perfect. I tweak it, I send it off, and I don't miss the deadline that otherwise I would have missed, because I always send my abstract like 15 minutes before the deadline, right? So I give them that example. Or I give them an example, I have an essay that I wrote, and I speak French, and I understand French, and I write French, but I'm not doing it every day, so it's tough for me. It's very laborious, right? To take something and write it in French. So I give the 1,000 word essay to the thing, it translates it, I look at it, it doesn't have my voice. I put my voice by changing some words and some phraseologies. Within half an hour, I've sent my essays, and people who don't read English or whatever, right, can read it in French. And even then, they're like, they come up with some high level abstract reaction to the existence of an AI that seems to behave in a very human way. So my question to you is this: number one, are you seeing the same thing more or less? Because again, 3 data points is not a pattern. Number two, do you think that there is something about our dogma that human beings are exceptional, that's interfering with being able to empirically look at the data, challenge notions, and then move forward in terms of our understanding and our engaging with these this new AI that seems to be challenging some basic cherished, perhaps almost taboos that we hold. I don't know if that long question makes sense, but what are your thoughts?
It makes sense. So I think if you're going to be a critic of these technologies, or even an advocate of these technologies, it's really difficult to do that without actually using the technology. You saw this back, in previous technological eras. You can go back to remember the video game dispute about video games and violence.
Yep.
And a lot of the people who were arguing that video games cause violence, or trying to prove that video games cause violence, whatever the case is, many of them did not play video games. It was this object that they were concerned with, and how it was affecting.
Yeah.
And actually, to take this all the way back, this is precisely what Socrates says about writing in the Phaedrus. Remember, Socrates, as many philosophers have pointed out, is the one who does not write, right? Plato is the one who writes.
Yes.
So in the Phaedrus, Socrates rails against writing, that writing is going to contaminate the oral tradition. It's going to lead to misinformation, and people are going to trust it when it says things that it's, purports to know when it knows nothing. And so Socrates was very, very adamant about critiquing and avoiding writing, but he never tried it, we could say. So his critique is always this kind of external critique.
Yeah.
And I think, on the one hand, we have to balance critical distance that's necessary to see something for what it is with engagement. And I think that's the real trick right now. But I think anyone who is serious about engaging this technology has to be in there trying out what this is all about, so that we are speaking from a place that is informed. I'll give you just 2 examples for myself. When I wrote the book on Remix, which is about originality and repurposing the past for the future, I knew I couldn't write about Remix unless I learned how to do Remix. So I spent about a year just cutting and pasting samples in digital form and playing with turntables and seeing what was possible, so that when I talked about remix and about the art of the DJ and all this sort of stuff, it comes from a place of direct engagement. The other one was when I was trying to explain to my students how machine learning works and what neural networks are. I discovered all the metaphors that we had were sort of clumsy. All the explainers that we could get were not fully informed in a way that would help them really grasp what the challenges and the opportunities were. And so I just built neural networks. I'm not a computer scientist by training, but I know enough coding to be able to build a very basic neural network, train it on some data, and see what results it produces. Now I have my students do the same. They do a symbolic reasoning version of a temperature conversion algorithm, and then they do a machine learning version of it. And in that little exercise, they actually can see immediately what the opportunities are with neural networks and what the challenges are. And this is something that you don't get with just reading content produced by somebody else. Your second question had to do with human exceptionalism.
Exactly.
And this is a really important question, because I think throughout history, the human has been encroached upon in terms of its boundaries that it has drawn between the animal and the machine. Donna Haraway makes this point in the Cyborg Manifesto. Norbert Wiener grapples with it in his cybernetics work. But every time we sort of draw the line that says, here is what makes us special, and the machine is different from us, we find that we are having to take a step back and redraw the line. So at one point, we thought calculation and mathematics during Descartes' time and Leibniz's time was going to be the defining condition. We can do this, machines can't. And of course, Leibniz built a calculator, right? And proved that the machine can do calculations. Then we said, okay, so maybe not mathematics, but decision making. And then we could make algorithms that had some capability of making decisions. So then we said, okay, chess. Algorithms will never play chess because it takes too much creativity. This is Hofstadter's insight, even Shannon's insight in the mid 20th century. And then we had algorithms that could play chess even better than human masters. So our last line of defense right now seems to be creativity. And this is where the large language models and the generative AI are sort of, again, challenging this boundary, saying, oh, you thought creativity was where you could draw the line of human exceptionalism. Now we have algorithms that can produce original music, that can make original paintings that are at least competitive with what human beings make. So I think we're finding ourselves in this position of recognizing that maybe this is more of a continuum and less a distinction, and that what makes us exceptional is a exception by degrees and not an exception that can be parsed into these sort of categories. This is an animal, this is a human, this is a machine.
Yeah. Well, why do we need to be exceptional, to be honest with you, is my question. Why do we insist on we are different from X?
It's a really good question, and it is a question that goes back to original definitions of what the human is in the history of human thought. There has always been this effort to create these very strict demarcations between the human and the other things in the world. So you can look, for example, at the Genesis story, and because the human is created in the image of God, in the Jewish and Christian traditions, that marks the human as being somewhat distinctive and different than the mere animals that are around him or her. You can see it in the Greek chain of being in the medieval philosophers, where you have this sort of pyramid, and at the top of the pyramid is the human being, right? Everything else is below. And we are given dominion, as the Genesis story says, over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the animals on the land, etc. And this justified a lot of exploitation. I mean, it justified a lot of what humanity has done to this planet, because we've seen the things around us as mere things, not as something that requires our respect, as something that requires our involvement. Now, I should say, this is culturally specific. A lot of indigenous traditions don't have this kind of hierarchy. You can look at both North American and South American indigenous thought and the way in which they looked at kinship relations, so that even the earth was considered a brother or a mother. And these are very different ways of looking at what the human being's place is in the world. But the sort of European tradition out of Christianity and Judaism has been this kind of domination position, where the human being is somewhat special and therefore able to exert his or her, but in those days it was his, will on the rest of the world around them.
Yeah. So well, let me just follow up on that one. If we take let's say religion, let's say monotheism, right? As an emergent property, an emergent phenomenon of more basic, let's say, pressures, right? And monotheism, I think, started when, well, long before humans settled, right? Although Islam is nomadic, not nomadic actually, it's there, we have cities and so on. Anyway, do you think that perhaps exceptionalism, it's not always a one answer, it's many things. Perhaps it had to do with the law, and the law applies to human beings, and so you need to make sure that what can own a property, a human being, not a dog, right? And so on. Do you think that's part of it as well?
Yeah, it is. In
Need
fact,
to
yeah, in law and in moral philosophy, we have been working with a kind of binary distinction. When I say we, we're mainly the West, right? Not all cultures play this game, but we do. And we divide the world into persons versus things. And that's a very convenient way of parsing reality so that we can make sense of all that is around us. And this comes from a very long tradition that gets codified by Gaius, a Roman jurist, in the early part of the Common Era, as we call it. And he says, the law is concerned with two things: persons and things. And so we have, over time, used these two categories as a way of helping us make sense of all that is. And when we confront something, the question is it a thing or is it a person? I'll give you a really good example of where this currently is a contentious issue. With the abortion debate and whether or not the fetus is a thing or the fetus is a person. If the fetus is a person, then all kinds of things, need to be taken into account with regards to how we treat it. If the fetus is a thing, then we have an entirely different way of dealing with the fetus as an entity. And you can see in the abortion debate, this is really the tension. One side deciding that it should be one side deciding it should be the other. And excuse me, in legal philosophy, there's this very important decision-making that has to take place, where we have not just defined thing or person, but also we have migrated some things that had been things into the category of person. So at one point in time, slaves were things. And with a very long, struggle, those things became recognized as legal persons. The same with women. Women at one point were considered the property of their husbands. And again, over a long struggle, they eventually became recognized as persons in their own right. So you can see these categories are fluid, and various entities can move from one category to another. It goes the other direction too, right? The one way the Nazis justified the extermination of Jewish people was to turn them into things.
With numbers.
Dehumanize them, but also depersonalize them. And this is the struggle, I think, that is really crucial with regards to these two categories. And we are now confronting things like AI and robots that really press on these two distinctions. Are they mere things that we can just utilize, or are they becoming kinds of persons? And again, you can see a debate between one side going one direction, the other side going the other direction.
Yeah. And it's I mean, that's why like we said at the beginning, it's really interesting to be alive in these times. Is now the question of what is a person, what is what is not a person, without having to look at, say, a body, right? Because now it's sort of like it's become abstract, like creativity, and maybe emotion, right? Can these things be, once you go beyond a couple of trillion of these neural whatever you call them, right? These nodes. Is it possible that there's an emergent property of emotion, perhaps? So it's really interesting to see this debate like evolve this way and become so, I would say, defined. It's very defined. Like, okay, here is a thing that when you ask it a question, it answers you, and it seems to be careful about how to phrase its things. Does it understand? So that we had one debate, and if it understands, um, uh, can we call it something that's semi-personal, or maybe Dana Haraway, it's a cyborg, and what status do we give it, and so on. Let me go to the next thing, which is, so we said creativity has been for the longest time the frontier of defining or sort of locating a characteristic of a human being as being sort of unique. But also I think emotions, right? Being able to feel pain. It's not confined to a human being, but in this debate about AI, people are saying, well, okay, so yeah, it creates whatever, but it doesn't feel, can't feel, right? So feeling is a necessary but not sufficient condition to be human. Okay, well, the robots don't have feelings, therefore they are lacking a very basic characteristic for being a human or a sentient being, even if you're not a human, because there are animal rights, and we don't want animals to suffer, and so on and so forth, right? So in this debate about the legal status of, say, an AI, or its personhood, or whether it is human or not, or can it become human eventually, what are your thoughts on this emotions debate?
Yeah, no, this is a really important question, and you're exactly right. This is how we opened up moral circle and the inclusion of others, by recognizing that it wasn't rationality that made something a person, but it was sentience, or it was the ability to feel pleasure and pain. And as a result, we started to include animals. The whole animal rights movement that Peter Singer and Tom Regan initiated really focuses on the experience of pleasure and pain as the criteria for inclusion, following a statement by Jeremy Bentham, which is, it isn't do they think, do they reason, it's do they suffer, right? And that utilitarian sort of way of thinking about others as a focal point of emotion, and especially the emotion of suffering, and minimizing suffering in the world. And that's really what a lot of the animal rights literature, at least in the early days, was all about. And so the question then becomes, well, okay, we won't need to worry about robots and AI until they show evidence of suffering. Until that time, they'll just be dumb things that we, can manipulate and utilize in various ways. But we don't have to accord them any respect because there's no suffering. I think this analogy sort of breaks down when we realize that suffering might not be the best criteria for moral status and for legal status. I'll give you just two examples of where this sort of gets into trouble. We, as a result of this kind of thinking, have allowed ourselves to convince ourselves that we can exploit the natural things in the environment because they don't suffer. Trees don't suffer, so we can just cut them down and turn them into houses and all kinds of other things. Mountains don't suffer, so we can strip mine them and extract all these resources, etc. So if suffering is the category that we utilize to recognize something's standing as a socially or morally significant other, we are excluding a lot of things that right now, especially in the climate crisis, we might want to rethink. We might want to have a little better relationship to the things of the natural environment as not just things, but as a element that is crucial to our flourishing, but also to the flourishing of the entire planet itself. So there's that component. The other one is we have to distinguish moral person from legal person. So moral persons tend to be natural persons like human beings and other entities that we could say experience joy, experience pleasure, pain, emotion, whatever the case is. But legal person doesn't really care necessarily about that. We can have legal persons that don't suffer, right? A really good example is the corporation. Corporations are persons not because you can harm a corporation and they will be hurt, but because of legal stipulations that recognize the corporation as a subject of the law and not an object of the law. And so when we talk about who is a person and what is a thing, we also have to recognize what sort of personhood we're talking about. There's different levels of personhood based on whether we're talking about moral persons or whether we're talking about legal persons. And so it seems very reasonable that AI and robots could be denied natural personhood due to the fact that they don't suffer, but could be accorded legal personhood based on the role they have to play in society and the fact that we want to hold them accountable or responsible for various actions that affect us and our world.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me follow up on that that notion where suffering stops being useful when it comes to, say, I don't know, cutting trees down and stripping, mountaintops and so on. If we isn't that reasoning possible only if you look at the tree as a thing outside of its ecosystem? Meaning, a tree is there and it has a whole ecosystem of things, of birds, of all kinds of creatures that we would say suffer, right? And if we were to say, by cutting down this tree, we will disturb this ecosystem and we will make these animals suffer, then we might say, okay, let's not do that, even though we believe that the tree does not suffer. Same thing with the mountain, right? If you strip off a mountain, obviously you're going to. Isn't that sort of a byproduct? I completely agree with your point. I'm just trying to pursue I'm trying to explore how certain concepts and certain conclusions are arrived at because we make some premises about the objects living on their own as opposed to being part of an ecosystem.
This is crucial because this is the legacy of Cartesian thought, right? This idea of the individual as the focus of everything. And if we individualize entities, we get a very easy way to parse them into persons and things. But if we take a more holistic look at the way in which these are embedded in ecosystems and networks, in relationships to all kinds of other entities simultaneously, then I think we get a different picture, because it's hard then to compartmentalize in this kind of way that's based on an individual entity as opposed to the larger environment in which it serves a larger purpose.
You've been listening to Humanity 8.0 with your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo, brought to you by Rokos. Thanks for listening.